All right, so welcome everyone to Chebacco Chats again for this Thursday. We're visiting today with Sam Younger, who has done a lot of research in Sorrento, but also down here on the island, looking at a relatively forgotten case study and a forgotten set of histories that we see in the early 20th century, particularly with the Harlem Renaissance and with figures such as W.E.B, DuBois and their connections to the island. So welcome, Sam, and we're looking forward to your talk today. There will be a short time for a Q&A at the end. So if you are joining with us on Zoom, the chat function is open to you. If you are joining us on Facebook Live, please put it into the comments and we will get through as much as we can. So thank you, Sam, and welcome. And we're looking forward to it.
All right, thank you, Patrick. Let me just start very quickly with a little background on myself. I've been summering in Sorrento for my entire life, for 60 years. And about 10 years ago, decided to do a little research into the history of Sorrento and try to find out more about things that had happened in earlier times when the resort was founded. Very early in that research, I came across this Time magazine article that was featured in September of 1927. On the cover was a portrait of British author E. Philip Oppenheim, and inside was a brief story detailing the news that an African-American New York real estate agent had acquired an option to purchase property in Sorrento, Maine. Sorrento was described in Time that week as a somewhat stodgy village where people rich and respectable, rather than smart, stay for a few weeks or a month or two. The article also noted that another New York firm headed by Joseph Edelman had originally held the option to buy the land. And in turn, it was reported that he had passed this right on to John E. Nail, who was planning to organize a fashionable Negro summer resort. In addition to being a Negro real estate operator, a footnote indicated that John E. Nail was a director of the NAACP. When I stumbled across this article, I was astonished. It had never been recounted in all the years that I'd been summering in Sorrento. I'd never heard of this account. And I thought this was such an important story to have remained forgotten for so long. So I wanted to do a little more research into it. And it led me to discover even more about John Nail. More importantly, I gained a broader appreciation of his life, his associations, as well as the obstacles that Nail encountered and ultimately ended his plans for a Black-owned resort on the coast of Maine. Just for a little background for those of you who aren't familiar with the area, where is Sorrento? Sorrento is at the head of Frenchman's Bay. If you stand at the top of Cadillac Mountain and look down east, Sorrento is viewable over the islands towards Sullivan. In fact, Sorrento used to be part of Sullivan. It is on what is known as WAUKEAG Neck. And Sorrento was founded as a resort in around 1886. Before that, WAUKEAG Neck was occupied by a bunch of settlers who were connected all the way back to the Revolutionary War and Captain Daniel Sullivan's brigade. Sullivan lived on the end of WAUKEAG Neck, and his house was raided by the British during the Revolutionary War. He was captured, taken away, and imprisoned in New York Harbor for a period of time, and later died in prison. Sullivan went through a number of iterations over the years, from timber, saltwater farms, fishing, and then moved into some other areas such as granite quarrying and mining. Surprisingly, there were a bunch of mining companies associated in the town of Sullivan, including a gold mine off the edge of WAUKEAG Neck. But eventually, tourism took over down East Maine, and a bunch of summer colonies, in addition to those on MDI and Mount Desert. There were summer colonies established in Lemoyne, Hancock, Winter Harbor, and one in Sullivan. And the first resort, this Gilded Age resort, was named Sorrento by the man who established the resort. And it was established from a series of purchases from the families that had the saltwater farms in Sullivan. Eventually, Sorrento became the investment of New Hampshire brewer named Frank Jones. And Frank Jones was the largest ale brewer in the United States in the late 1800s. He was born in 1832 in Barrington, New Hampshire. He owned a variety of businesses in addition to his breweries in Portsmouth and Boston. He was also a successful Democratic politician. He was in Congress in the 44th and 45th Congresses, which were seminal events for the United States, including the Compromise of 1877. He served as a Democratic representative that year in that contested election. He was also had numerous interests in New England railroads, and he was one of the owners of the Boston and Maine Railroad, the train that eventually ran to Hancock and where the ferries to Mount Desert Island departed. Jones died in 1902. And so after less than 2 decades, the Sorrento resort lost its largest supporter. Jones had a very complicated estate. This is a story unto itself. He had a longtime paramour, and she sued the estate for more than $500,000. So his estate was tied up in court for a number of years. But eventually, the lands that he owned and his company owned eventually went to new owners. It's just a little bit about Frank Jones. I'll get into the story about John Nail. So around the same time that Sorrento was established in the late 1880s, John Nail was born. John Nail ended up being a leading Harlem real estate investor. But he grew up in Manhattan, where his father and uncle were successful African-American businessmen. The two owned a high-class hotel, bar, and billiards parlor on 6th Avenue and 28th Street, catering to African-American gentlemen. That section of New York, by the way, was the section where Blacks in New York lived in the early 1800s. In 1903, his father, John B. Nail, was quoted in a newspaper article that the secret for a wealthy and educated Black man was to remain as inconspicuous as possible, so far as the white people are concerned. After helping his father at the hotel for several years, the younger Nail moved on to become a broker for Philip A. Payton's Afro-American Realty Company, one of the earliest Black-owned real estate companies in Harlem. Nail then established his own real estate firm with his partner, Henry C. Parker. One of Nail's most significant real estate transactions occurred in 1911, when he represented the St. Philip's Episcopal Church, one of the oldest Episcopal parishes in New York City, when they wanted to sell their land holdings around 25th Street in Manhattan. And the sale funded the construction of a new building for the church that was designed by an African-American architect, Vertner Woodson Tandy, that was built on West 135th Street in Manhattan. He then helped the church to reinvest the remaining proceeds from that sale in 10 Harlem apartment buildings on the same block. The shift of Black residents from other areas of Manhattan was not without problems, however, and Nail's company managed the apartment buildings for the church and wanted to rent them to Black tenants. A group of white tenants sued when they were displaced, but a local magistrate judge ruled that they could not block the evictions and permitted Nail to rent to whomever he wished. As we know, over the next few decades, the population of Black residents in Harlem would more than double and usher in what is become known as the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem became the center of African-American life in New York City and established Upper Manhattan as the cultural mecca of African-American literature, music, and art. John Nail didn't limit his investments to real estate, however. Nail had lots of other investments. One of the most interesting was he was one of the founders of the first Black recording company. It was based in Harlem. It was called Black Swan Records. Began in 1921 as the record division of the Pace Phonographic Corporation with a gentleman named Harry Pace. Pace had been a partner of W.C. Handy's in Memphis in music publishing and a former college student of W.E.B. DuBois in Atlanta. The record label was named for an African-American opera singer named Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, who was known as the Black Swan. And along with Nail, the company's board of directors included DuBois and James Weldon Johnson. The label was notable for its recordings of Ethel Waters and for hiring Fletcher Henderson before he went on to fame with Duke Ellington. I'll just point out here, this is a picture from around 1915 of John Nail. This is actually in the Bronx, driving with James Weldon Johnson. And the connection between Nail and Johnson, you may be familiar with James Weldon Johnson. He wrote the song Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is known as the African-American national anthem. He was multi-talented. He was a lawyer, composer, and poet, but he was also married to John Nail's sister, Grace. So they had a personal connection besides their business interests. In addition to his business dealings, John Nail also became a leader in civil rights and was an early director of the NAACP when it was founded. Alongside activists such as W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson, the group helped to plan what was known as the 1917 Silent Protest Parade. This was organized in the wake of the controversial 1915 silent movie Birth of a Nation, which had glorified the KKK and helped spark to rise KKK-led violence around the country. And this 1917 march was one of the first civil rights marches held in Manhattan. Hundreds of participants paraded down Fifth Avenue to protest racial lynchings and a series of violent riots that summer. And in photos of the parade, Nail can be seen leading the marchers together with his fellow organizers, Johnson, Du Bois, the pastor of the church, Hutchins Crew of the St. Philip's Episcopal Church. Regrettably, just a couple of years later, there was another series of riots, which has become known as the Red Summer, where Blacks were lynched, houses were burned, neighborhoods pillared throughout the country. Before W.E.B. Du Bois was associated with the NAACP, Du Bois was teaching at a Black university in Atlanta. Du Bois was one of the early scholars and voices for Blacks in America and a fierce advocate for civil rights. In 1903, the year after Frank Jones of Sorrento died, Du Bois was invited to Mount Desert to speak to an audience at Northeast Harbor. Du Bois was a native of Massachusetts. He had attended Fisk University, a historically Black institution in Nashville, and in 1895 had become the first Black man to receive a PhD from Harvard, and was famously quoted as saying, "The honor, I assure you, was Harvard's." During this visit to Mount Desert Island, he was the guest of the Harvard president, Charles Eliot, who summered at Northeast Harbor. In 1903 was also the year that Du Bois published his seminal work, The Soul of Black Folks, in which he first expressed the conflict he labeled as double consciousness. He explained this as the struggle that Black Americans experienced, always looking at oneself through the eyes of a racist society and measuring oneself by the means of a nation that looked back in contempt. Du Bois was describing being shut out from the white world by a vast veil and asked, "Why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in mine own house?" That 1903 visit was not his last to Maine. In fact, in 1905, Du Bois was invited back to Northeast Harbor by one of his colleagues, Edward T. Ware, who also summered in Northeast Harbor, and he was the president of the university called Atlanta University, where they both taught. On this visit, he was also invited by the Shefflin family to deliver a second speech at the Bar Harbor Swimming Pool Club. This visit and both lectures are notable as Du Bois seemed to have made the trip to Maine on his way back from the initial Niagara Conference, which was the beginning of the Niagara movement held that summer in Niagara Falls. And the Niagara Conference is really seen as the beginning of the modern civil rights movement in America. At that conference, attendees from around the country called for the end of segregation and boldly expressed its principles that we refuse to allow the impression to remain that Negro American assents to inferiority, its submissiveness under oppression and apologetic before its insults. In 1908, Du Bois was invited to Bar Harbor again, this time by Jane Addams of Hull House in Chicago. She was staying as the guest of Louise and Joseph Bowen at their estate in Bar Harbor. Addams had once quipped that she could raise more money in a few weeks in Bar Harbor than any place else for the rest of the year. In fact, in 1912, Du Bois, when Du Bois was founding the NAACP, he invited Addams to be one of the charter members and serve on the board of the interracial organization. After World War I, Du Bois published another autobiographical work, this one entitled Dark Waters, Voices from Within the Veil. The book includes a remarkable description of the beauties of numerous national parks he'd visited, including Acadia, which had been established several years earlier. Evidently, the coast of Maine was compelling to Du Bois, and in chapter 9, entitled Of Beauty and Death, he describes in sweeping detail the awe it inspired. Bar Harbor lies beneath a mighty mountain, a great bare black mountain that sleeps above the town. But as you leave, it rises suddenly, threateningly, until far away on Frenchman's Bay, it looms above the town in withering vastness, as if to call all that little world petty save itself. Beneath the cool, wide stare of that great mountain, men cannot live as giddily as some lesser summer playground. Before the unveiled face of nature, it lies naked on the Maine coast, rises a certain human awe. God molded his world largely and mightily off this marvelous coast, and meant that in the tired days of life, men should come in and worship here and renew their spirit. This I have done, and turning I go to work again. As we go, ever the mountains of Mount Desert rise and greet us on our going, somber, rock-ribbed and silent, looking unmoved on the moving world, yes, yet conscious of their everlasting strength. The book goes on to recount many trips he took around the country and descriptions of the nature that he explored. But he also talks about the inequities and indignities that Blacks experienced traveling in Jim Crow America. In one pointed description of a segregated train travel, he sadly notes a Black woman who quietly observes, "No, we don't travel much." Sorrento has a particularly somber connection with Jim Crow laws. It was the summer home of Chief Justice Melville Fuller. Fuller was a native of Augusta, graduated from Bowdoin College, and he and his family summered in Sorrento beginning in 1894. He also died at the age of 77 at his cottage there. Fuller, of course, presided over the US Supreme Court when it voted in its 1896 seminal case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which of course institutionalized the doctrine of separate but equal, which spelled the end of efforts during Reconstruction to limit racial segregation. And the legacy of that decision, of course, would cast a shadow over American race relations until the 1950s, when other efforts toward desegregation began. So back to our story about Sorrento. In 1908, new investors stepped in and bought the land originally owned by the Jones family. In fact, it was one of the investors was a gentleman named George Grant, who was from Ellsworth. Grant, together with Fred Lyman, had founded the Bar Harbor Bank and Trust Company in 1887. For the next 2 decades or so, Grant and a succession of partners and companies attempted to market the land at Sorrento. But by 1925, the land and buildings once owned by the Jones family were controlled by a new company, the Charles A. Mann Realty Company of Manhattan. No one really had successfully sold any land. Sorrento was very far away from most places. Bar Harbor was still thriving, but it was nothing like it was in the Gilded Age. The great homes were still there, but I don't think it was quite the place it was in the 1890s. This is an advertisement from the Bangor Daily News that proclaims Sorrento as the most beautiful spot on the Maine coast. And by 1927, the real estate company was trying to divest itself of its holdings in Sorrento, which at that point was about 600 acres of land, about what they had purchased from the Jones estate in 1908. They really had not ever successfully marketed Sorrento again as a going concern. They engaged a firm called Joseph P. Day, one of the largest auction companies on the East Coast. And the instructions today were to sell the land regardless of cost, value, or price. And the terms were required that 70% of the purchase price would be paid within 30 days of the auction in August of 1927. So after the auction, in addition to the Time magazine article, news followed about John Nail's purchase of the option to buy the land. One of them was in the New York Times, in the Sunday real estate pages, that Nail had secured the option to acquire the property, and went on to say that he and his partner would lead a syndicate of Negro friends to finance the purchase. The headline indicated that because of the distance between Bar Harbor and Sorrento, there did not seem to be any concern on Mount Desert Island as to what it termed the potential colored invasion. The New York Times article included another detail, that another real estate investor named Joseph Edelman had originally held the option rights. Neither the amount of Edelman's winning bid nor how much Nail needed to raise to exercise his option was disclosed. Although not part of the reporting, I have considered the possibility that an effort was made to deflect from Nail's involvement by possibly drafting Edelman to make the winning bid in Bar Harbor. We'll probably never know if there was some sort of prearrangement to have Edelman submit the bid and then quietly transfer his rights onto Nail. But this scenario is sort of circumstantially supported by an announcement a few years earlier that I found that listed Edelman not as a real estate investor, but instead as an advertising director employed by the Joseph P. Day company, the company that ran the auction. So I have my doubts that Edelman really was some sort of outside investor, and perhaps he had been put up to being a front for at the auction. Some other reporting I found, one was in the New York Amsterdam News, and this covered the story on September 7th. It provided a few more interesting details, including the news that Nail and Parker intended this to be an exclusive resort with sales of estates costing $30,000 to $100,000. And the backers were careful to say that they planned to have only a few families at first and gradually build up sales to what they said were the most desirable element. However, the article also pointed out that an option might end like similar attempts to establish Black-owned resorts in the country and come to naught by being later repurchased by white people. It went on to conclude that many professed to see in the announcement nothing more than a scheme to force the sale of Sorrento by injecting the color question into it. Despite these worries, the correspondent wished Nail and Parker well and pointed out that if they could finalize the deal, it could be a profitable one, since many well-to-do citizens of color all over the country have longed for such a place. Coverage of the transaction in another Black-owned newspaper had a slightly different slant. This one from the Pittsburgh Courier, that city's African-American paper, exclaimed, "Bar Harbor is alarmed." This was the exact opposite of the sentiment seen days earlier in the New York Times article that seemed to indicate that there were no worries in Bar Harbor. It's not clear if this article was based on any actual reporting or simply editorializing when it claimed that Bar Harbor was perturbed and filled with a feeling of uneasiness bordering on alarm. The paper went on to declare that the Nordic high and mighty who fear a Negro invasion should be viewed with amusement and pity and disgust, arguing that if these same people who were seemingly allies of those seeking civil rights would only practice what they preach, the Negro's lot in this country would be much different than what it is. The article concluded with an exasperated tone that defended the plan to establish a Black-owned resort. Although the new owners would be polite, urbane, tidy, and altogether a credit to the section, some Nordics are as much disturbed as though the state of Maine was going to establish a prison farm next door. It concluded by calling these people who would allow the colored prejudice to warp their minds as not entirely sane, and described America as a nation that is really a lunatic asylum insofar as skin color is concerned. Despite the story in the Pittsburgh paper exclaiming the possible fears about a Black-owned resort, the headline on the same day in the Black-owned New York Age echoed the New York Times article, indicating there was no excitement over the purchase. This reporter also seems to have taken the time to study a map and points out that the 8-mile distance between the bathing beaches removes any possibility of conflict. To secure financing for the project, Nail and Page may have tried to interest some of their friends in show business to provide backing. An article in late September in the Pittsburgh Gazette makes it appear that Ethel Waters and her husband Earl Dancer were approached to participate. It was also reported that the actor Paul Robeson and singer Florence Mills and a heavyweight boxer named Henry Wills might also buy estates. in Sorrento. While the Amsterdam News may have been speculating that the entire deal might just be a scheme to force the sale of Sorrento by injecting the color question into it, the action Nail took next demonstrate that he believed that the purchase could become a reality. Clearly, he couldn't finance this purchase alone and would need to secure additional investors. And to invest and to advance that effort, he organized a trip to Maine. The following documents I found in the W.E.B. DuBois papers at the University of Massachusetts, and these are remarkable to me. And the first is a letter that describes a trip, November 2nd, that Nail would travel by overnight train from Grand Central Station from New York City to Maine. He was accompanied on the trip by some of his friends. One was the editor of the New York News named George Harris. The other was the head of the Urban League, Eugene Nickel Jones. The head of the YMCA of Harlem, Thomas Taylor. His old friend from Black Swan Records, Henry Pace, who at that point was a life insurance executive for a black life insurance company he founded, and also by W.E.B. DuBois. So November 18th, 1927, a few weeks after their scouting tour, DuBois sent Nail a follow-up together with an account of their recent trip to Maine. DuBois wrote his report to support Nail's effort to raise funds needed to exercise his option on the Sorrento property. As we've seen, he was very familiar with this section of the coast from his earlier visits. And in this letter, he describes the area as a combination of mountains and sea, the highlands coming straight down to the water with islands and deep indentations into the land, rolling hills, rocks, trees, and beautiful resorts as one of the most beautiful places in the United States. He goes on to extol Sorrento's advantages with 3 hotels, a golf course, swimming pool, docks, boat landings, a post office, excellent roads, clean water, and most importantly, a population of kindly people without race prejudices. DuBois went on to outline the sales pitch and asked, are there enough American Negroes who appreciate a quiet, exclusive resort of this sort to finance it? Instead of marketing to a few well-to-do purchasers, DuBois proposed finding 500 persons able to invest $1,000 each into the proposition and be part of one of the finest summer settlements in the United States. At the time, the average salary for Blacks I've looked up was less than $50 per week, and a luxury of $1,000 was likely beyond the means of most. Indeed, based on the failures of the prior owners to generate interest in land sales in the town, finding 500 persons of any race able to spend $1,000 per acre was a daunting task. Despite his effort, it appears Nail wasn't not able to secure the funds necessary to exercise his option to purchase the Sorrento property. Remember that the auction terms indicated that 70% of the purchase price had to be provided within 30 days. And based on some later deed records I've found, I estimate that his group would have had to have raised nearly $30,000 to $50,000 to acquire the land. The country was in the midst of a recession, 1926 and 1927. His Black-owned enterprise would have faced a daunting challenge to quickly find the financing. Just as a side note, one of the entertainers noted in one of the early articles, Florence Mills, who was a huge star at the time, died just one day before Nail and his group took their trip to Maine at the age of 31. She had starred in W.E.B. Blake's hit musical Shuffle Along together with Paul Robeson. She was billed as the Queen of Happiness, and her funeral was held on November 6th in Harlem. And this is a picture of some of the 10,000 people that turned out for that funeral. Over the next few years, Nail struggled as the American economy faltered, and his dream to develop an African-American resort in Sorrento also ended. This is a poignant 1928 letter he wrote to DuBois about another investment, where he laments that he entered the business with lots of ideals, but after 21 years, he was ready to adjust myself to conditions over which no individual has any control. In the increasingly declining economy, he experienced problems financing his other businesses. Even before the stock market crash of 1929, he was forced to charge increasingly higher rents to cover his expenses. In 1929, he was accused of rent slavery by the Daily Worker in New York City when tenants of his organized rent strikes. And like so many others during the Great Depression, by 1933, Nail was forced to declare bankruptcy, and he never really fully recovered his real estate holdings. He was able to protect the St. Philip's Church properties from losing their properties to foreclosure. But the deal that he negotiated with a white-owned company to lease the property required that the church accept no revenue for 10 years. In 1947, John Nail passed away at the age of 63, and his obituary at the time was featured in the New York Times. As to the 600 acres of land in Sorrento, it doesn't appear that any other buyers stepped forward after the 1927 auction to exercise the purchase option. So even though Nail had the option, there's no indication that anybody else stepped forward to outbid it or to stop the sale to John Nail. It was simply a matter of the timing and financing. Like John Nail, the company that actually owned the mortgage on the company, the Charles Mann Company, who had originally auctioned and mortgaged the land, also did not fare well in the Great Depression. And by 1934, a Northeast Harbor investor named Merritt Ober foreclosed on the mortgage that he held at the time. And after Merritt's sudden death in May of 1935, it would be another decade until the Ober family ever sold the land. So just a little speculation on my part. I would have no clue how the little town of Sorrento may have evolved if John Nail had succeeded in buying the land in 1927. Would have Sorrento have become a summer haven for African Americans, similar to those on Oak Bluffs in Massachusetts and Sag Harbor in New York? How would the families who had vacationed there for decades and the year-round residents reacted if the land had been sold to John Nail? I like to think that the town and its inhabitants would have welcomed the new people, especially after DuBois described it as having a population of kindly people without race prejudice. This is another interesting side note and not well known, that there was a summer resident of Sorrento who may have readily embraced the Nail purchase. Her name was Louise Bouvier Drexel Morel. She was the widow of Edward DeVoe Morel. Louise owned a large estate in Bar Harbor named Thurlestane, but they also owned an island off the coast of Sorrento and a couple of cottages in town. Her husband died, I believe, around this time, and she sold their mansion in Bar Harbor. Some of the land that the Morels own is where Jackson Labs is today. There was a horse farm, a horse race course named Robin Hood Race Course, I believe. And Louise Drexel Morrell's sister was Mother Catherine Drexel, the founder of the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, and the second American canonized as a saint. The Drexel sisters used the bulk of their inheritance from the Drexel family to fund educational institutions for both Native Americans and African Americans. Among the many institutions they founded were Xavier University in New Orleans, the only historically Black Roman Catholic university. And many years earlier, they had founded a school in Harlem, right down the block from where John Nail had his operation on 138th Street. They founded the St. Mark's School, the first Catholic school in New York City for African American children. So that's sort of the end of my tale. If you'd like to read this and other tales, I have a little blog that goes into the history of Sorrento. I keep adding things as we go along. So I will try to stop sharing. And come back. Hello, Patrick.
Right. Yeah. Good to see you again. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation over something that is really overlooked in our local histories. And it is a really interesting thought on what might have happened if circumstances would have been just slightly different at that one point in time. So thank you to Sam Younger for being our speaker this week on Chebacco Chats. We will meet again in 2 weeks with another speaker and wrap up the spring season for Chebacco Chats. So thank you for joining us, and we will see you again in 2 weeks.